Hello, I'm Kevin Berger, author of Atheism is Untenable, a book in which I argue why skeptical atheism crumbles beneath its own weight. On this channel, I don't engage in apologetics. Instead, I apply the principles of polemics and skepticism to atheism and the claims made by atheists, of which, despite their claims to the contrary, there are many, including these, among others. This is Justified Nonetheless. If you enjoy or find my content interesting or informative, be sure to subscribe, turn on those notifications, like and share, and be sure to check out the Justified Nonetheless Patreon project for even more exclusive content. Hello again, my little tumbleweeds. I had not intended to create this video. However, it has become increasingly apparent that it would be necessary because, on the one side, the religious commentators viewed Matt Dillahunty's decision to walk out on his debate on Christianity versus secular humanism as a victory by his opponent over secular humanism, which it is not. Similarly, the atheist commentators on my video defending Matt Dillahunty's decision to walk out considered that to be an endorsement of secular humanism, which again, it is not. So first, let us take a look at why the argument made by his opponent is not a victory over secular humanism. He mentioned Christian ethics and Christianity in general once each during his opening statement. However, despite mentioning them, he never actually makes a case for why they are superior to secular humanism. No, he instead conceded the entirety of Matt's worldview, of which secular humanism is only a part. By my count, he mentioned the word secular humanism a total of 6 times during his opening statement, yet he mentioned Matt by name twice as often. He spoke, among other things, about gender ideology, which is not a tenet of secular humanism, underage sex, which is not a tenet of secular humanism, the presupposition that the laws of logic are real, which is not a tenet of secular humanism, and reproduction, which is not a tenet of secular humanism. He railed on and on against these positions, yet at no point did he ever link any of them to secular humanism directly, as tenets explicitly stated in the humanist manifestos. No, he literally says, I'm going to grant Matt's entire worldview, and that includes positions that are not derived from secular humanism. By arguing exclusively against such positions without demonstrating that they were derived from secular humanism, his opponent was at no point on topic. Further, by granting Matt's worldview, he effectively rendered the debate a moot point. Matt could have just as easily said, you know what, I'm glad that you agree with my worldview. I guess there's nothing here to debate. All of the evidence indicates that it was never his opponent's intent to debate Christianity versus secular humanism. Conversely, the religious people were complaining, but what about Matt's comments on Mike Johnson? Well, as far as Mike Johnson goes, here's an excerpt from Matt's opening statement. Mike Johnson is the new Speaker of the House. He's homophobic as all get out because he's argued to criminalize homosexuality. Homosexuals, by the way, are U.S. citizens with specific rights that he wants to take away. Moreover, he advocated for anti-gay conversion therapy, which is unscientific and torturous because he thinks he can help them pray the gay away and the gay can be eliminated. He's not anti-gay, he just wants him to cease to exist as gay. They get to keep being human beings. He thinks there's no right to sodomy. Privacy laws don't protect everything, and he thinks what sort of sex you have should be his to regulate. And I can further clarify this by quoting Mike Johnson himself. Question about comments and actions deemed by many to be homophobic. The new Republican U.S. House of Speaker Mike Johnson of Louisiana told Fox News his worldview was, go pick up a Bible. Speaking on Thursday, Johnson said he generally loved all people regardless of their lifestyle choices. This is not about the people themselves. I'm a Bible-believing Christian. Someone asked me today in the media, they said, people are curious. What does Mike Johnson think about any issue under the sun? I said, well, go pick up a Bible off your shelf and read it. That's my worldview. That's what I believe, and I make no apologies for it. Johnson added, that's my personal worldview. There are a couple of key points to note here. Firstly, after thanking James for hosting the debate and his opponent for participating, Matt never again mentions him by name. Secondly, the only comment directed toward Mike Johnson is that he's a homophobic person. Everything else that follows is directed toward his ideology and his policies, which, being informed by Christianity, are on topic. And based on this, the conclusion that he is homophobic is justified. It wasn't an ad hominem attack, it was a statement of fact. It leaves no room for ambiguity or confusion. As noted earlier, Matt ascribes to a worldview of which secular humanism is just a part. Mike Johnson's worldview, in his own words, is the Bible. Per Mike Johnson himself, yes, his homophobic stance, for example, is based explicitly on Christian ethics. Therefore, since the topic of the debate was Christianity versus secular humanism, Matt's argument was on topic. Unless some direct connection can be made from his opponent's arguments to the tenets of secular humanism, that argument was not on topic. No amount of Matt believes X will ever amount to anything without a direct link to secular humanism. His opponent did not make that connection. No one else has made that connection. No one can make that connection. This is impossible because secular humanism addresses these issues in precisely the same way that atheism addresses empiricism, materialism, and naturalism. It doesn't. Now, with that out of the way, we can proceed to my second point for this video, that being why, although I agree that Matt was right to walk out on the debate, this is not an endorsement of secular humanism, because I do disagree with Matt. Note that this is not an argument for Christianity or anything else, because I don't do apologetics. Rather, this is an argument against secular humanism. Actually, I do see the issue with secular humanism's intrinsic ambiguity and ensuing subjectivity. Had that been the target of the argument leveled by Matt's opponent, he could have made a valid case. Instead, while he mentioned this, saying, and I'm going to paraphrase slightly here, the cornerstone of secular humanism is totally meaningless, flourishing by whose metric? He instead targeted Matt's views, and neither Matt nor his views were the topic of debate. Rather, the topic of the debate was Christianity versus secular humanism, as I keep pointing out. In order to argue against Matt's views, one would first have to establish that those views are informed by secular humanism, as demarcated by the humanist manifestos. A legitimate approach would be the following. According to the Humanist Manifesto 3, humanist ground values in human welfare shaped by human circumstances, interests, and concerns. And in his book, Enlightenment Now, The Case for Reason, Science, Humanism, and Progress, Steven Pinker reviews the original manifesto and reviews the 2003 Humanist Manifesto 3 and defines humanism as the goal of maximizing human flourishing. Matt, as a secular humanist, advocates for X, believes in Y, and does Z. However, we don't know if this is representative of secular humanism because none of the humanist manifestos directly address these subjects, nor do they explicitly identify a metric for human welfare or human flourishing. A pro-choice case can be made from the right to bodily autonomy that abortion is an example of human welfare and human flourishing. However, even without an appeal to some divine entity, a compelling case can also be made that it is an example of human welfare and human flourishing to provide the unborn human an opportunity to live. A case can be made that it is human welfare and human flourishing to affirm the gender identities of others, but a case can also be made to the contrary. A case can be made for all sorts of things under the guise of human welfare and human flourishing when there's no clear understanding as to what exactly is meant by these terms. A case can be made, for example, based on the obesity epidemic and the litany of health issues that it causes, that fat-shaming people in an effort to prompt them to be healthier will lead to human welfare and human flourishing. But based on the emotional and mental health crisis that we are facing, a case can be made that allowing people the freedom to live as they choose will lead to human welfare and human flourishing. Thus, the issue isn't so much what position one holds on any of these subjects, since they clearly aren't informed by any tenet of secular humanism itself. Rather, the issue is that humanists apparently can't even agree on what the hell human welfare and human flourishing is, let alone then identify any objective metric by which to determine what will lead us to it. The fact there are individuals who are also humanists who disagree with Matt on a variety of subjects is indicative that secular humanism is as useful as a moral standard as atheism is as an explanation for anything. That is to say that it's not. It is ultimately useless due to the intrinsic ambiguity and subjectivity. By addressing the issue in this way, neither Matt nor his views are what is being scrutinized, rather is secular humanism itself. Further, it is not the tenets of secular humanism or positions endorsed by secular humanism that are contested, but the fact that it doesn't make any. In addition, Matt and Matt's views are only being mentioned to illustrate that they aren't derived from secular humanism because secular humanism doesn't make a definitive stance in the first place. One commentator asks, what is secular humanism to you? My answer, and this should be obvious as well as incontrovertible, whatever specifically and explicitly stated in the manifestos. This may or may not be accompanied by additional ideologies derived from elsewhere that are not a part and partial to secular humanism itself. I think this is where the disconnect lies and why we find ourselves talking past one another. Take abortion, for example. Matt Dillahunty's view comes from the idea that a woman has a right to bodily autonomy, and this right of the woman apparently supersedes those of the unborn for whatever reason. Christopher Hitchens' view was that an unborn human is a human. Human has a right to live, and that right is sacrosanct. However, abortion is not an issue that is directly addressed by the humanist manifestos, nor is bodily autonomy. As a result, although Dillahunty and Hitchens were both secular humanists, they had opposing views on that issue that were derived from elsewhere. When I mentioned that, someone responded saying Christopher Hitchens supported the right to abortion. That's misleading. In an interview, Hitchens said, I don't think feminism should contradict humanism. Nobody on the left can avoid noticing that the so-called pro-life forces are overwhelmingly female and from income groups that traditionally voted Democratic. Yet the simple rebellion by what one might dare to term humble people has been written off as reactionary by people who can't or won't see the essential dignity of the right to life position. I had a queasy feeling about the disposability of the fetus. This queasy feeling has not gone away. Once you allow that the occupant of the womb is even potentially a life, it cuts athwart any glib invocation of the woman's right to choose. Hitchens stated in his book, God is Not Great, an unborn child seems to me a very real concept. It is not a growth or an appendix. You can't say the right question doesn't come up. I don't think a woman should be forced to choose or even can be, and as a materialist, I think it has been demonstrated that an embryo is a separate body and entity. Hitchens may very well have acquiesced to abortion in some cases, as do I, and I'm sure others. However, he clearly objected to it. And this is based on his own words. Babu Gogonyeni, writing for Human International, says, child marriage, like forced marriage or rape, is a form of non-consensual sex and an abuse of human rights. It is prohibited by a number of international conventions. Of course, a child cannot consent anyway, marriage or not. There may be disagreement as to what constitutes the age of majority. However, by law, children cannot consent, and there are laws against this. I would like to think that it is obvious from the objection that this isn't just an objection to child marriage itself, but to what accompanies it, the deprivation of choice of forced marriages and non-consensual sex. Gogonyeni continues his statement to the Human Rights Council in Geneva. In our statement, we call upon the states to take all necessary actions to end the practice of child marriage by, inter alia, fully implementing all of the relevant human rights conventions, rectifying the legislative loopholes between religious, customary, and civil marriages, introducing laws to raise the legal age of marriage to 18 years, and so on. So clearly and demonstrably, there are humanists, unlike Matt, who do wish to introduce legislation that would address underage sex. Opinions on what form such laws should take may vary, just as there is disagreement as to whether there should be any laws at all, but some humanists do advocate for them while others do not. Why? Because secular humanism does not directly address this either. Transgender rights is a subject that Matt and other humanists support, yet Richard Dawkins, a humanist, spoke against this, arguing that there are only two sexes from a biological standpoint. He, of course, can do this without it being an example of hypocrisy, because human secularism makes no pronouncement on the subject in its manifestos. There are humanists who advocate for veganism, as is Jason Torpy of thehumanist.com, arguing your health, animal welfare, and the environment are good reasons to oppose animal production for food. This is a question of priorities. Humanist values, as I understand them, put a premium on health, animals, and the environment. Humanists should be able to suffer some inconvenience to reduce their carbon footprint and their cruelty footprint. However, there is no shortage of meat-eating humanists, of which I do believe that Matt Dillahunty is one. It's no different, ultimately, than the fact that being an atheist tells us absolutely nothing whatsoever about whatever else the individual does or does not believe. The fact that secular humanism doesn't define well-being, human welfare, human flourishing, a metric for measuring, or a methodology for achieving it is a valid criticism of secular humanism. However, that's not the argument that Matt's opponent made. No, his argument was Matt believes X, Y, and Z. So what? It's a case of Matt believing X, Y, and Z, and he's a secular humanist, versus Matt believes X, Y, and Z because he's a secular humanist. The latter was the argument his opponent was implying. He failed because secular humanism doesn't take an official stance on X, Y, and Z. His opponent should have made that his argument. He should have focused his argument not on Matt's worldview, which I keep pointing out is informed only in part by secular humanism, but on what the hell does human flourishing even mean? What exactly constitutes human welfare under secular humanism? How can we objectively measure it? Who determines that metric? Under what basis? And so on. Given that secular humanism doesn't specifically explicitly address any of these things, my line of argumentation isn't against Matt or any humanist worldview, but the fact that its intrinsic ambiguity and subjectivity allows for such a wide variety of conflicting worldviews. That is to say, I argue Dawkins is a humanist and he advocates, believes, and does A, B, and C. Hitchens was also a humanist and advocated, believed, and did D, E, and F. Matt is a humanist who advocates, believes, and does G, H, and I. And this other humanist over here advocates, believes, and does J, K, and L. And I could go on and on and on. They're all humanists, yet they don't agree on these significant issues because secular humanism is this nebulous idea of human welfare and human flourishing that is undefined and so means different things to different people. How is that any better than competing religious sects? For that matter, how is that any different from competing religious ideologies? And there you have it. That is the case that I make against secular humanism. Not that the positions that it promotes are immoral or irrational, but that it doesn't promote any concrete positions at all. In the words of German theoretical physicist Wolfgang Pauli, it's not only not right, it's not even wrong. With that, I will bid you adieu, and I will remind you once again that even if your beliefs aren't necessarily true, they should be justified nonetheless.